The transport shuttle rumbled to a stop on the concrete apron of Falcon Base's primary training airfield, and Lieutenant Ava Morin stepped out into the crisp morning air. Around her, 23 other cadets gathered their gear and began walking toward the flight line, their voices carrying the excited chatter of pilots eager to get their hands on Apache helicopters. Ava had learned long ago to read a room within seconds of entering it. At West Point, she'd been one of only 12 women in her engineering class. During advanced flight school, she'd grown accustomed to being the only female face in a sea of skeptical stares. But this morning felt different, heavier somehow, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. She adjusted her flight bag and began walking toward the aircraft assignment board, keeping her expression neutral despite the whispers that followed her across the tarmac. These weren't the discreet murmurs of professional assessment she'd grown used to. These were intentionally loud comments, designed to be overheard. "Wonder how she got selected for Apache training," someone muttered behind her. "Probably filled a quota," another voice responded with a snicker. Ava kept walking, her military bearing unchanged. She dealt with worse than whispered assumptions. What concerned her more was the tone, not just dismissive, but almost predatory, as if her mere presence had painted a target on her back. Chief Warrant Officer Marcus Granger stood near the control tower, observing the incoming class with the practiced eye of a 20-year veteran. Multiple combat deployments and thousands of flight hours had taught him to assess pilots quickly and accurately. He watched as the cadets scattered across the flight line, noting who gravitated toward leadership positions and who hung back uncertainly. His attention lingered on Lieutenant Morin. Unlike the others, she moved with purposeful efficiency, checking her assigned aircraft number and heading directly toward her helicopter without the usual nervous energy of new students. There was something about her composure that caught his interest, a quiet confidence that seemed earned rather than assumed. "Henderson, Martinez, Williams," Granger called out, addressing 3 of the more vocal cadets. "You're up first for systems familiarization. Morin, you'll start with pre-flight procedures on Aircraft 7. As the group dispersed, Ava approached. Her assigned Apache, a massive, intimidating machine that could deliver devastating firepower or extract soldiers from impossible situations. She began her methodical walk-around inspection, her trained eyes scanning every critical component with the focused attention that comes from understanding that aircraft maintenance isn't about passing tests, it's about staying alive. That's when Cadet Henderson, a tall, cocky second-year student, decided to make his opinion known. "She's not a real pilot," he announced to his companion, his voice carrying across the tarmac with theatrical volume. "She's just a PR stunt wearing a flight suit." The comment landed like a physical blow, reverberating across the concrete with cruel precision. Several other cadets laughed appreciatively, some nervously joining in to avoid becoming targets themselves. No one stepped forward to correct the assumption. No one spoke in her defense or challenged the casual cruelty. Ava didn't turn around to confront her critics. She didn't offer a defensive response or attempt to justify her presence. Instead, she simply continued her inspection, marking each checklist item with practiced efficiency, never once looking up to acknowledge the audience that was clearly expecting some kind of dramatic reaction. Her flight gloves showed the telltale wear patterns of extensive flight time. Her uniform patches were positioned with military precision. Everything about her suggested competence, but Henderson and his friends saw only what they wanted to see. A woman who didn't belong in their world. From his position near the control tower, Granger observed the entire interaction. Part of military training involved learning to handle pressure and hostility from unexpected sources. From his vantage point, Ava appeared to be handling the situation with professional composure, silent, precise, and completely focused on her assigned tasks, despite the obvious attempts to distract and intimidate her. She's probably just afraid. To speak up and draw more attention, someone behind Granger muttered, apparently assuming the instructor shared their dismissive assessment. Granger didn't respond to the comment, but something about Ava's demeanor caught his attention and held it. The way she moved around the aircraft wasn't the cautious uncertainty of a new student. It was the confident efficiency of someone who'd performed these procedures countless times under significantly more challenging conditions. Her silence wasn't born from fear or insecurity. It was the quiet competence of someone who understood that talk was cheap, but flight performance was everything. As the morning progressed and training exercises began, the atmosphere around Ava grew increasingly hostile. Every mistake by any cadet was somehow attributed to her distraction. Every successful maneuver by her was dismissed as luck or instructor favoritism. Henderson had successfully turned what should have been a professional training environment into a hostile workplace, and no one seemed inclined to stop him. But Chief Warrant Officer Granger was beginning to suspect that Henderson and his followers had no idea who they were actually dealing with. Something about Lieutenant Morin's composed response to their harassment suggested depths they couldn't even imagine. The question was, how long would it take for the truth to surface? The morning's Apache systems familiarization should have been straightforward and identify key components, demonstrate understanding of flight controls, and show basic competency with pre-flight procedures. For most cadets, it was an opportunity to impress their instructor and establish themselves as serious pilot candidates. For Ava, it became a gauntlet of deliberate interference and calculated humiliation. Henderson had positioned himself strategically, within earshot of every training station, ready to provide commentary on her performance. When she correctly identified the Apache's targeting system components, he stays whispered to Martinez, probably memorized the manual last night to make up for not having real experience. When she demonstrated proper control stick positioning, Williams chimed in with, "Easy to look good when you're not actually flying the thing." The comments were carefully crafted to sound like casual observation while being loud enough for everyone to hear. Other cadets began glancing between Ava and her tormentors, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. The unspoken message was clear. Supporting her would mean becoming targets themselves. Chief Warrant Officer Granger watched. The dynamic developed with growing concern. This wasn't typical military hazing or the usual competitive banter between pilot candidates. This was systematic harassment designed to undermine one specific person's confidence and standing within the group. During the mid-morning break, Ava approached Granger near the equipment shed. Her expression remained professional, but he could see the tension in her jaw. "Chief, I need to address some concerns about the training environment," she said quietly. "What kind of concerns, Lieutenant?" "The commentary from some cadets is becoming disruptive to the learning process. I don't need anyone to fight my battles, but this is affecting the entire group's focus." Granger nodded slowly. He'd heard the comments and seen the dynamic, but hearing it directly from her gave him a clearer picture of the situation's severity. "Have you spoken directly to the individuals involved?" "I've tried to address it professionally, but direct confrontation seems to escalate rather than resolve the issue. I'm requesting guidance on how to proceed without compromising my standing in the program." It was a reasonable request, professionally presented. Ava wasn't asking for special protection or demanding immediate action against her harassers. She was trying to work within the system to resolve a legitimate problem. Granger's response would set the tone for everything that followed. "I'll make some general comments to the group about professional standards," he said. "In the meantime, focus on your training performance. Results speak louder than commentary." Ava nodded and returned to her training station, but Granger could see the disappointment in her shoulders. She'd hoped for more decisive action, and his lukewarm response felt like abandonment. Henderson had been watching the conversation from across the tarmac, and when Ava walked away, he smirked at his companions. "Looks like someone's already complaining to the instructor," he announced. "Can't handle a little pressure from fellow pilots." The comment was the final straw for Cadet Jennifer Walsh, a quiet third-year student who'd been watching the harassment escalate all morning. She approached Henderson directly, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Maybe you should focus on your own performance instead of commenting on everyone else's," she said. Henderson turned his attention to her with predatory interest. "Oh, look, the girls are sticking together. How sweet." "I'm not sticking with anyone," Walsh replied evenly. "I'm suggesting you act like a professional pilot instead of a high school bully." The confrontation drew attention from across the flight line. Other cadets stopped their activities to watch, sensing that the morning's tension was finally reaching a breaking point. "You know what I think?" Henderson said, his voice rising. "I think some people are here because of their qualifications, and others are here because the military needs good PR photos. And I think everyone knows which category applies to who." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a crash site. Henderson had moved beyond casual mockery into direct character assassination, publicly questioning Ava's right to be in the program at all. Ava heard every word from her position near Aircraft 7, but kept her eyes focused on her equipment checklist. Her hands remained steady as she verified hydraulic connections and checked control surface movement, but anyone watching closely could see the slight tightening around her eyes. Chief Warrant Officer Granger had also heard Henderson's latest outburst, and this time he couldn't ignore it. He walked over to where the cadets had gathered, his expression darker than anyone had seen all morning. "Henderson, Martinez, Williams," he said in a voice that cut through all other conversation. "My office, now." The three cadets exchanged glances, suddenly uncertain whether their behavior had crossed a line they hadn't noticed. "The rest of you, back to your training stations. This isn't entertainment." As the crowd dispersed, Granger looked across the tarmac toward Ava, who was still methodically working through her pre-flight procedures. Something about her absolute focus under pressure continued to nag at him. Most new cadets would be rattled by this kind of harassment, but she seemed almost accustomed to it. He made a mental note to review her personnel file more thoroughly after dealing with Henderson's disciplinary issue. There might be more to Lieutenant Morin's background than her basic service record indicated. For now, though, he needed to address the immediate problem before it poisoned the entire training environment. Henderson and his followers were about to learn that military professionalism wasn't optional, regardless of their personal opinions about their fellow pilots. But even as he headed toward his office to deliver that lesson, Granger couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important about the quiet lieutenant who'd somehow become the target of so much hostility. The disciplinary meeting in Chief Granger's office lasted exactly 12 minutes. Henderson, Martinez, and Williams emerged looking subdued but not particularly chastened. They'd received the standard lecture about military bearing and professional conduct, along with written warnings for their personnel files. But as soon as they were out of earshot, Henderson was already plotting his next move. "He can't watch. It was every second," Henderson muttered to his companions during lunch. "And she can't run to Daddy Instructor every time someone hurts her feelings." What Henderson didn't realize was that his subtle harassment was about to become significantly less subtle and far more dangerous. That afternoon's training focused on emergency procedures and crisis management scenarios. Cadets were required to respond to simulated equipment failures, navigation errors, and hostile fire situations. It was the kind of high-pressure testing that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. When Ava's turn came for the emergency landing simulation, Henderson positioned himself at the monitoring station where he could observe her performance and provide helpful commentary to the other cadets. "Watch this," he whispered loud enough for half the room to hear. Bet she freezes up when things get complicated. The simulation began with a routine flight pattern, then quickly escalated into a cascade of system failures. Hydraulic pressure, loss, navigation system malfunction, and simulated enemy fire all within the span of 90 seconds. Ava's response was immediate and precise. She executed a textbook emergency auto-rotation, identified alternative landing zones, and maintained radio communication throughout the crisis. Her hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency. Her voice remained calm and clear as she coordinated with simulated ground support. It was a flawless performance that should have earned respect from her fellow cadets. Instead, Henderson seized on the one aspect he could criticize. Easy to look good when it's just a simulator, he announced to his gathered audience. Real emergencies don't come with reset buttons. The comment was particularly cruel because it implied that Ava had never faced actual danger, that her competence was purely theoretical. Several cadets shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that Henderson had crossed from criticism into personal attack. Cadet Walsh, who'd already confronted Henderson once, couldn't stay silent. That was exceptional flying, she said clearly. Anyone with eyes could see that. Henderson turned on her immediately. Exceptional for someone who's never had to deal with real consequences for failure, he shot back. Some of us have actually been in situations where mistakes cost lives. The accusation was loaded with implication that Henderson had combat experience while Ava did not, that his criticism came from a position of superior knowledge and experience. It was a claim designed to establish hierarchy and justify his continued harassment. Chief Warrant Officer Granger had been observing the simulation from the back of the room, and Henderson's latest outburst finally pushed him past his tolerance threshold. But instead of another disciplinary meeting, he decided it was time to do some deeper research into his students' backgrounds. That evening, while cadets were in their barracks discussing the day's training, Granger remained in his office reviewing personnel files. He'd started with Henderson's record, curious about the combat experience the cadet had been implying all day. Henderson's file showed solid academic performance and competent flight training scores, but his actual military service consisted entirely of domestic training assignments. No deployments, no combat experience, no hostile fire situations. His confidence was built on potential rather than proven performance. Martinez and Williams had similarly limited service records competent pilots, but without the real-world experience they'd been claiming through implication and association with Henderson's bravado. Then Granger opened Ava's complete military file, and his understanding of the entire situation shifted dramatically. The information that appeared on his screen was so unexpected that he initially thought there'd been an administrative error. He cross-referenced the data multiple times, accessed additional databases, and verified the documentation through official channels. There was no mistake. Lieutenant Ava Morin's previous unit assignment, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, Airborne, the Nightstalkers. Total documented combat flight hours, 880. Specialized night operations, 31 confirmed missions. Mission classification, Tier 1 Direct Action Support. Military decorations, Air Medal with Valor Device, Distinguished Flying Cross, Joint Service. Commendation Medal, Combat Deployment History, Afghanistan, Iraq, Classified Special Operations Locations. Granger leaned back in his chair, the full implications of what he was reading beginning to sink in. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the legendary Nightstalkers, represented the absolute pinnacle of military aviation excellence. These weren't regular Army pilots who'd earned their wings through standard training programs. They were hand-selected elite aviators who flew the most dangerous missions in the most challenging conditions, often behind enemy lines with zero margin for error. Henderson had been mocking a combat veteran with more operational experience than most pilots accumulated in entire careers. He'd been questioning the qualifications of someone whose service record exceeded those of many instructors. And he'd been doing it while claiming superior knowledge based on training assignments he'd never actually completed. The irony was staggering, but more importantly, it explained everything Granger had been observing. Ava's composure under pressure, her precise technical knowledge, her calm response to harassment. These weren't the characteristics of someone struggling to belong. They were the hallmarks of someone who'd already proven herself in circumstances that would terrify her critics. She hadn't mentioned any of this during her introductory presentation to the class. She hadn't written her special operations background on the whiteboard when students were asked to share their previous experience. She didn't wear her old unit patches or display any indication of her extraordinary service record. She didn't need to advertise her credentials. Her competence spoke for itself to anyone with the wisdom to recognize it. Granger closed the file and walked to his office window, looking out at the barracks where his students were probably still discussing the day's training. Tomorrow's session was going to be very different from today's. It was time for some education about respect, assumptions, and what military expertise actually looked like. The next morning's briefing began with an unusual announcement from Chief Warrant Officer Granger. Today's training will include advanced combat scenario simulations, he informed the assembled cadets. These exercises are designed to test decision-making under extreme pressure, the kind of situations where theoretical knowledge isn't enough. Henderson exchanged confident glances with his companions. Advanced combat scenarios played perfectly into his narrative about real military experience versus academic achievement. He was already planning his commentary for whatever performance Ava would deliver. The first scenario involved a night extraction mission in hostile territory. Simulated enemy fire, equipment malfunctions, and navigation challenges would test each pilot's ability to function under maximum stress. It was the kind of exercise that typically humbled even experienced aviators. When Ava's name was called for the first run, Henderson couldn't contain his anticipation. "This should be interesting," he murmured to Martinez. "Let's see how our PR pilot handles actual combat pressure." Ava entered the simulation cockpit with the same calm composure she'd shown all week. The scenario began immediately. Night flight over mountainous terrain. Radio chatter indicating ground troops in contact. Multiple system warnings flashing across her instrument panel. What happened next left the entire room in stunned silence. Ava didn't just manage the crisis, she dominated it. Her responses were immediate, precise, and tactically sound. She identified the optimal extraction route while simultaneously troubleshooting hydraulic failures and coordinating with simulated ground forces. Her radio communications were crisp and professional, conveying essential information without wasted words. When the simulation threw additional complications at her simulated surface-to-air missile threats, weather deterioration, fuel system warnings, she adapted seamlessly, executing evasive maneuvers that most pilots would need multiple attempts to master. The exercise that was designed to challenge experienced aviators, she completed flawlessly in a single attempt. The room remained silent for several seconds after the simulation ended. Even Henderson seemed momentarily speechless, struggling to find criticism for a performance that had been objectively exceptional. But his need to maintain his position as alpha critic proved stronger than his recognition of competence. "Lucky run," he finally announced, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Easy to look good when you know it's just a game." This time, his comment fell flat. The other cadets had witnessed something that couldn't be dismissed as luck or simulator familiarity. Ava's performance had displayed the kind of instinctive, tactical knowledge and crisis management skills that came only from extensive real-world experience. Cadet Walsh spoke up immediately. That wasn't luck. That was expertise. Expertise? Henderson's voice rose defensively. Based on what? Running training simulations? Some of us have actually been in real combat situations where what? The question came from Granger, who had been observing the exchange with growing interest. Complete that sentence. Henderson, where exactly have you been in combat situations? Henderson faltered, realizing he'd made a claim he couldn't substantiate. I mean, I've trained for combat situations. I've prepared for. You've trained, Granger interrupted. You've prepared. You've simulated. But you've never actually flown a combat mission, have you? The question hung in the air like an unexploded ordnance. Henderson's face flushed red as he realized his bluff had been called in front of the entire class. Neither has she, he said defensively, gesturing toward Ava. That's when Chief Warrant Officer Granger made a decision that would change everything. Lieutenant Morin, he said formally, would you please remain after this briefing? The rest of you are dismissed to individual study periods. As the other cadets filed out, Henderson shot a triumphant look back at Ava. In his mind, she was finally being called out for her lack of real experience. He couldn't have been more wrong. Granger waited until the room was empty before speaking. Ma'am, I owe you an apology, he said, his tone shifting to one of genuine respect. I should have reviewed your complete service record before allowing this harassment to continue. Ava looked puzzled. I'm not sure I understand, Chief. 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, Granger said simply. 880 combat flight hours. 31 confirmed Special Operations missions. Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor device. Ava's carefully maintained composure finally cracked slightly. She hadn't expected her background to become part of the training discussion. That was a different assignment, she said quietly. I'm here to learn Apache systems, same as everyone else. No, ma'am, Granger replied. You're here because the Army recognized that your experience with the Nightstalkers makes you an invaluable training asset. And I've been allowing a bunch of students with zero combat experience to mock someone who's forgotten more about tactical flying than they'll learn in their entire careers. The weight of recognition settled between them. Ava had been trying to fit in, to avoid drawing attention to her exceptional background. But her attempt at humility had been interpreted as weakness by people who had no idea what they were actually looking at. What happens now? She asked. Granger smiled for the first time all week. Now we set the record straight. And Henderson gets a lesson in what military respect actually means. Outside in the hallway, Henderson was still basking in what he assumed was his victory over the PR pilot. He had no idea that his world was about to be turned completely upside down. The breaking point had been reached, and the truth was finally ready to surface. Word spread through the barracks that night with the efficiency that only military gossip could achieve. By morning formation, every cadet at Falcon Base knew that something significant was about to happen during the day's training session. Chief Warrant Officer Granger had spent the evening preparing what he privately referred to as an education in military excellence. He'd pulled additional documentation from Ava's service record, cross-referenced her mission reports with declassified operation summaries, and contacted former colleagues from the 160th to verify details that seemed almost too extraordinary to believe. Every verification confirmed the same conclusion. Lieutenant Ava Morin wasn't just a competent pilot, she was an elite combat aviator whose operational experience exceeded that of most senior officers. As cadets assembled for morning briefing, Henderson maintained his usual confident demeanor, still convinced that yesterday's events had somehow vindicated his position. He'd managed to convince himself that Granger's private meeting with Ava had been disciplinary rather than revelatory. Martinez and Williams flanked him as always, ready to provide support for whatever commentary their leader might offer about the day's training activities. Attention! Granger's voice cut through the morning chatter with unusual authority. The cadets snapped to formation with crisp precision, sensing that today would be different from previous sessions. Before we begin flight operations, Granger announced, we need to address some misconceptions about qualifications, experience, and what constitutes military expertise. Henderson straightened slightly, assuming this was the validation of his criticisms that he'd been waiting for all week. Henderson stepped forward. Henderson moved to the front of the formation, his confidence intact. He expected to be recognized for his leadership in maintaining standards within the training program. Tell the class about your combat experience, Granger instructed. The request caught Henderson off guard. He'd been implying superior knowledge for days, but always through suggestion rather than direct claims. I've trained extensively for combat operations, he began carefully. That's not what I asked. I asked about your combat experience, your actual operational deployments, your time flying missions in hostile territory. Henderson's face began to flush as he realized the trap he'd walked into. I haven't been deployed yet, but my training, your training, Granger interrupted, consists entirely of domestic flight school assignments. No deployments, no combat missions, no hostile fire situations. Is that correct? Yes, sir, but no buts. Your service record shows competent academic performance and adequate flight training scores. Nothing more, nothing less. You're a student pilot with potential, not a combat veteran with proven experience. The humiliation was public, complete, and devastating. Henderson had built his authority on implied expertise that had just been systematically dismantled in front of his peers. But Granger wasn't finished. Now, he continued, let me tell you about real combat experience. He turned toward Ava, who had been standing at attention with growing discomfort as she realized what was about to happen. Lieutenant Morin, please step forward. Ava moved to the front of the formation, her expression carefully neutral, despite the obvious direction of Granger's presentation. Lieutenant Morin served with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Nightstalkers, Granger announced to the stunned assembly. For those of you unfamiliar with that unit, they represent the absolute pinnacle of military aviation excellence. The silence that followed was profound. Every pilot in training knew the reputation of the Nightstalkers, even if they'd never met anyone who'd actually served with the legendary unit. 880 documented combat flight hours, Granger continued. 31 confirmed special operations missions in Afghanistan and Iraq. Night insertions and extractions behind enemy lines. Direct action support. Classified operations I'm not authorized to discuss. Henderson's face had progressed from red to pale as the full scope of his miscalculation became clear. Air Medal with Valor device for actions under enemy fire. Distinguished Flying Cross for exceptional airmanship during combat operations. Joint Service Commendation Medal for meritorious service in joint special operations. Each decoration Granger listed represented achievements that most pilots could only dream of attaining. The PR stunt Henderson had been mocking possessed. Qualifications that exceeded those of many senior officers. Every single person in this formation, Granger said, his voice carrying absolute authority, owes Lieutenant Morin considerably more respect than crude jokes and ignorant assumptions. The revelation hit the assembled cadets like a physical force. They'd been witnessing the systematic harassment of someone whose service record represented everything they aspired to achieve in their military careers. Henderson stood frozen, his entire worldview crumbling, as he realized he'd been attacking exactly the kind of pilot he'd always claimed to be. Henderson, Granger said quietly, you have something to say to Lieutenant Morin. The moment stretched endlessly. Henderson faced a choice between his pride and his integrity, between maintaining his false position and acknowledging the truth that had just destroyed all his assumptions. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. I was wrong, completely wrong." Ava nodded simply, not making the moment more dramatic than necessary. "Apology accepted," she said quietly. But the damage to Henderson's authority was complete and irreversible. The natural leader who'd been setting the tone for the entire training program had been revealed as a fraud whose confidence was built on nothing more substantial than assumptions and arrogance. As the formation dispersed for the day's training activities, the power dynamic at Falcon Base had been fundamentally altered. Respect had finally been directed where it belonged, and everyone present understood that they were learning alongside someone whose qualifications exceeded those of their instructors. The fight back had begun not with confrontation or revenge, but with the simple revelation of truth. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply letting competence speak for itself. Within 24 hours, the story of Lieutenant Morin's revealed background had spread far beyond Falcon Base. Military social media networks, veteran forums, and professional pilot associations were buzzing with a photograph that had been taken during Granger's revelation, a moment captured when he'd formally saluted Ava in front of the assembled cadets. The image showed Granger, a decorated 20-year veteran, standing at attention with his cap removed in a gesture of profound respect, while Ava stood nearby with the composed bearing that had characterized her throughout the entire ordeal. The caption accompanying the viral photograph read simply but powerfully. They called her a diversity token. Then her instructor read her file and took off his cap. The post exploded across military communities worldwide. Comments poured in from pilots, mechanics, and military personnel who understood the deeper significance of what the image represented. Nightstalkers don't need to brag about their missions. They just execute them perfectly and move on to the next objective. Maximum respect to the quiet professionals. I served alongside her during operations in Iraq. She pulled off an emergency extraction that saved our entire ground team when our primary bird went down. Never mentioned it afterward. This is why you don't judge people based on appearance or assumptions. Female pilots in special operations face double the scrutiny and have to be twice as good to earn half the respect. She earned every bit of recognition she's getting. Henderson watched the online discussion unfold with growing horror. His name hadn't been mentioned in any of the posts, but people were sharing stories about arrogant cadets and students who don't know their place. The implication was clear. He'd become the unnamed antagonist in a story about military respect and professional humility. Worse, several people who knew him from previous training assignments had connected the dots and were beginning to ask pointed questions about his role in the harassment. His reputation, which he'd spent years carefully building, was crumbling in real time across multiple platforms. Martinez and Williams, who'd supported Henderson's campaign against Ava, now found themselves associated with what military communities were calling the biggest display of ignorance in flight training history. Their social media profiles were flooded with messages questioning their judgment and professionalism. But the online humiliation was only the beginning of Henderson's problems. 3 days after Granger's revelation, Henderson received notice that his conduct during training was being formally reviewed by the base commander. Several cadets had filed complaints about the hostile environment he'd created, and his academic performance was being scrutinized in light of questions about his character and leadership potential. The review wasn't just administrative. It had career-ending implications. Military aviation was a small community where reputation mattered more than almost anything else. Henderson's name was becoming synonymous with unprofessional conduct and poor judgment. Meanwhile, Ava continued her training with quiet dignity, neither acknowledging the online attention nor responding to interview requests from military publications. Her focus remained on completing her Apache certification, just as it had been from the beginning. But the atmosphere around her had transformed completely. Cadets who'd remained silent during her harassment now approached her with genuine respect and curiosity. They asked thoughtful questions about special operations flying, listened carefully to her technical insights, and recognized that they were learning alongside someone whose experience could enhance their own training. Chief Warrant Officer Granger had also learned valuable lessons from the week's events. He'd implemented new protocols for reviewing student backgrounds before program start, ensuring that exceptional experience would be recognized and respected rather than hidden and dismissed. During a private conversation with Ava, he expressed his regret about the entire situation. "I should have known," he admitted. "Your composure, your technical knowledge, the way you handled pressure, all the signs were there. You couldn't have known," Ava replied diplomatically. "I deliberately kept my background low-key to avoid exactly this kind of attention. That humility might work in other environments," Granger said. "But in military aviation, experience like yours should be celebrated, not hidden. You've got knowledge that could benefit every pilot in this program." The conversation marked a turning point in how the training program would operate going forward. Ava's expertise would be formally recognized and utilized, while Henderson's behavior would serve as a cautionary tale about the consequences of disrespect and assumptions. For Henderson himself, the downfall was accelerating beyond his ability to control. The cadet who'd entered the program as an assumed leader was now facing possible dismissal, his military career hanging by threads that were fraying more each day. The power dynamics at Falcon Base had been completely reversed, and everyone involved was learning that in military aviation, respect isn't given based on assumptions. It's earned through proven performance and professional competence. The formal review hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning in Base Commander Colonel Patricia Reynolds' office. Henderson sat in the waiting area, his dress uniform impeccable but his confidence shattered. 3 weeks earlier, he'd been the unofficial leader of his cadet class. Now, he was facing potential dismissal from the program that represented his entire career trajectory. Across from him sat Lieutenant Ava Morin, who'd been called as a witness to provide her account of the harassment incidents. She maintained her characteristic composure, reviewing notes with the same focused attention she brought to every professional task. The contrast between them was stark and telling. Henderson fidgeted nervously, checking his watch repeatedly and rehearsing explanations in his mind. Ava sat calmly, prepared to answer questions honestly and completely without dramatization or embellishment. When they were called into Colonel Reynolds' office, the formal atmosphere immediately established the gravity of the proceedings. Reynolds, a seasoned officer with her own distinguished aviation background, had reviewed all the documentation and witness statements. Her expression suggested that she'd already reached preliminary conclusions about the case. "Cadet Henderson," she began, "you're here because multiple witnesses have described a pattern of harassment, unprofessional conduct, and behavior unbecoming a military officer. Do you understand the severity of these allegations?" Henderson straightened in his chair. "Yes, ma'am. But I believe there may have been misunderstandings about—" "There were no misunderstandings," Reynolds interrupted. "We have detailed witness statements describing specific incidents where you publicly questioned Lieutenant Morin's qualifications, made derogatory comments about her presence in the program, and created a hostile environment that affected the entire training class." She turned to Ava. "Lieutenant Morin, please describe the impact this behavior had on your training experience." Ava's response was measured and professional. "Ma'am, the comments were disruptive to the learning environment, but my primary concern was the effect on group cohesion and morale. When one member of a training unit is targeted for harassment, it affects everyone's ability to focus on their professional development. Henderson seized on what he perceived as an opening for defense. "Ma'am, if I may, Lieutenant Morin never disclosed her background to the class. How are we supposed to know about her special operations experience? We were operating on the volunteer information available to us." Colonel Reynolds' expression hardened. "Are you suggesting that respect for fellow officers is conditional upon knowing their service records?" "No, ma'am, but because if that's your position, Cadet Henderson, then you fundamentally misunderstand military professionalism. Respect isn't earned through documentation. It's the baseline expectation for all interactions between service members." The colonel opened Henderson's file on her desk. "Let's examine your information available, shall we?" Lieutenant Morin completed the same pre-program requirements as every other cadet. Her academic scores were exemplary, her fitness reports were outstanding, and her conduct was beyond reproach. What additional information did you need to treat her with basic professional courtesy? Henderson realized his defense was crumbling, but desperation drove him to continue. "Ma'am, I was concerned about maintaining standards in the program. Military aviation requires..." "Don't." The single word from Colonel Reynolds cut through his explanation like a blade. "Don't you dare claim you were protecting military aviation standards while harassing one of the most qualified pilots to ever enter this program." She stood and walked to the window overlooking the flight line, where training operations continued under Chief Granger's supervision. "Cadet Henderson, do you know what the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment represents?" "Yes, ma'am." "Elite pilots who..." "Elite doesn't begin to cover it," Reynolds interrupted. "The Nightstalkers are hand-selected from the top 1% of military aviators. They undergo additional training, the washout rates exceeding 70%. The pilots who succeed represent the absolute pinnacle of military aviation excellence." She returned to her desk and opened Ava's service record. Lieutenant Morin didn't just serve with the 160th, she excelled with them. 31 combat missions, many classified at levels I'm not authorized to discuss. Emergency extractions under hostile fire. Night insertions behind enemy lines. Operations where pilot error would have meant death for multiple ground personnel. Henderson's face had gone pale as the full scope of his miscalculation became undeniable. "While you were questioning her qualifications," Reynolds continued, "she was demonstrating competence that exceeds many senior officers in this command. While you were making jokes about PR stunts, she was quietly showing the kind of professional humility that defines true military excellence." The colonel's voice dropped to a tone that was somehow more intimidating than shouting. "You claimed to be protecting standards, Henderson. But Lieutenant Morin is the standard. She represents everything we hope to develop in military aviators: technical excellence, tactical competence, professional behavior, and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from proven performance under impossible conditions." Henderson finally understood that no defense would save him. His assumptions, his arrogance, and his systematic harassment had been directed at exactly the kind of officer he'd always claimed to be. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I was wrong. Completely wrong. I let my assumptions override my professionalism, and I created an environment that was harmful to everyone involved." For the first time since the hearing began, his words carried genuine remorse rather than calculated defense. Colonel Reynolds studied him carefully. "That acknowledgement is a start, Henderson, but it doesn't undo the damage you've caused to unit cohesion, training effectiveness, and your own professional reputation." She looked at Ava, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. "Lieutenant Morin, do you have any additional comments for the record?" Ava considered the question carefully before responding. "Ma'am, Cadet Henderson has acknowledged his errors and apologized. From a professional standpoint, that's what matters most." The military benefits when people learn from their mistakes and become better officers. Her response was generous beyond what Henderson deserved, and everyone in the room recognized it. She could have demanded maximum punishment, could have detailed every humiliation she'd endured, could have destroyed his career with a single condemning statement. Instead, she'd chosen to focus on professional growth and unit effectiveness. Over personal vindication, Colonel Reynolds nodded slowly. "Very well. Henderson, here's your situation. You'll be removed from this training cycle and enrolled in a professional development program focusing on leadership, respect, and military bearing. You'll write formal letters of apology to every member of your training class, and you'll complete additional academic coursework on military ethics and conduct." Henderson's relief was visible. He'd expected complete dismissal from the program. "Don't mistake this for leniency," Reynolds continued. "This is your one opportunity to salvage your military career. Any future incidents of unprofessional conduct will result in immediate separation from service. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am. Completely." Dismissed. As Henderson left the office, his military bearing was different, less arrogant, more genuinely respectful. The experience had been devastating, but potentially transformative if he chose to learn from it rather than resent it. Colonel Reynolds addressed Ava privately after Henderson's departure. "Lieutenant, I want to personally apologize for allowing this situation to develop. Your service record should have been properly recognized from day one." "Thank you, ma'am. But the experience taught valuable lessons about assumptions and professional behavior. Sometimes the most effective education comes from overcoming challenges rather than avoiding them." Reynolds smiled for the first time during the hearing. "That perspective is exactly why Special Operations selected you in the first place. The program is lucky to have you." As Ava left the colonel's office, she reflected on the week's events. Justice had been served not through punishment or revenge, but through truth and the natural consequences of unprofessional behavior. Henderson's downfall had been complete, but not vindictive. He'd been given an opportunity to learn and grow from his failures. The climax was over, but the real resolution would come in how everyone involved chose to move forward from this defining moment in their military careers. 6 months later, Lieutenant Ava Morin stood before a new class of Apache training candidates at Falcon Base. Chief Warrant Officer Granger had requested that she co-instruct the Advanced Combat Scenarios portion of the program, formally recognizing her expertise in a way that would benefit every future pilot. The students before her represented a new generation of aviators who'd heard the story of the quiet professional through military networks and social media. They looked at her with genuine respect from day one, understanding that her presence represented an extraordinary opportunity to learn from someone with real operational experience. Advanced combat flying isn't about individual heroics or dramatic maneuvers, she began her first lecture. It's about consistent professional competence, crew coordination, and making sound decisions under extreme pressure. The missions you'll fly will be successful not because you're exceptionally brave, but because you're exceptionally prepared. In the back of the classroom, Henderson sat quietly taking notes. His remedial training had been comprehensive and humbling 6 months of ethics courses, leadership seminars, and one-on-one mentoring with senior officers who'd helped him understand the difference between confidence and arrogance. He'd written personal letters of apology to every member of his original training class, acknowledging his unprofessional behavior and expressing genuine regret for the hostile environment he'd created. The process had been difficult but necessary for his personal growth and professional development. When the class ended, Henderson approached Ava's desk with obvious nervousness. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for your recommendation that I be given a second chance in the program." Ava looked up from her lesson plans. "Your performance over the past 6 months earned that recommendation, Henderson. People can change if They're willing to do the work required. I know I can never completely undo the damage I caused, he said carefully, but I want you to know that experience taught me more about military leadership than any textbook ever could. What did you learn? She asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Henderson considered the question thoughtfully. I learned that real confidence comes from competence, not comparison. I learned that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn through consistent professional behavior. And I learned that assumptions are dangerous in any environment, but potentially fatal in military aviation. Ava nodded approvingly. Those are valuable lessons. How will you apply them going forward? By focusing on my own performance instead of judging others. By treating every fellow officer with respect, regardless of their background or appearance. And by remembering that there's always more to learn from people who seem quiet or different. It was a mature response that suggested genuine growth rather than surface-level compliance with requirements. Henderson, Ava said, military aviation needs officers who can learn from their mistakes and become better leaders. Your willingness to acknowledge errors and make real changes shows the kind of character that can serve the mission effectively. The conversation represented closure for both of them, Henderson's journey from arrogant harassment to professional humility, and Ava's transition from harassment target to respected instructor and mentor. 2 weeks later, the graduating class from that training cycle received their Apache pilot certifications in a ceremony attended by base leadership and family members. Henderson graduated in the top third of his class, his performance reflecting the genuine effort he'd put into professional development. During the reception following the ceremony, Chief Granger reflected on the lessons learned from the previous year's events. The military benefits when we create environments where competence is recognized and respected, he told Colonel Reynolds. Lieutenant Morin's experience taught us that assumptions can blind us to exceptional talent, and that professional behavior isn't optional regardless of personal opinions, Reynolds nodded. She's become one of our most effective instructors, precisely because she combines technical excellence with the kind of quiet leadership that inspires rather than intimidates. Across the room, Ava was surrounded by new graduates asking questions about tactical flying and special operations missions. She answered each inquiry thoughtfully, sharing technical knowledge while emphasizing the teamwork and preparation that made successful missions possible. Her approach to teaching reflected the same professional humility she'd shown throughout her harassment. Ordeal competence without arrogance, confidence without condescension, expertise shared generously rather than hoarded protectively. The story that had begun with cruel assumptions and systematic harassment had evolved into a powerful example of how truth, professionalism, and quiet competence ultimately prevail over arrogance and ignorance. Henderson, now preparing for his first assignment as a certified Apache pilot, carried with him lessons that would shape his entire military career. The officer who'd once mocked qualifications he couldn't recognize had learned to appreciate excellence wherever he found it. Ava continued her service with the same quiet distinction that had always characterized her approach to military aviation. She didn't need recognition or vindication. Her competence spoke for itself to anyone wise enough to listen. The viral photograph of Chief Granger's respectful salute still circulated through military communities, serving as a reminder that assumptions are dangerous. Respect is earned through behavior rather than documentation, and the most qualified people are often the quietest about their achievements. For everyone involved, the experience had been transformative. Justice had been served not through punishment or revenge, but through education, growth, and the natural consequences of professional behavior, both good and bad. In the end, the Padillas token pilot had proven to be exactly what military aviation needed most. A quiet professional whose competence elevated everyone around her, and whose response to adversity demonstrated the kind of character that defines true military leadership. The story concluded not with dramatic confrontation or vindictive triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction that comes from truth recognized, respect earned, and professional excellence acknowledged where it belonged. Sometimes the most powerful victories are won not through battle, but through simply being excellent at what you do, regardless of who notices or appreciates it. Lieutenant Ava Morin had embodied that principle from beginning to end, and in doing so, had taught everyone around her what military professionalism actually looked like. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.